background. I think really what I'm talking about today is why I decided to investigate this and why I thought it was really important. And I've obviously walked in on some of the conversations, and I think it's really pertinent to those conversations in particular around identity and belonging and feeling detached from any kind of sense of community or social unit. I'm a sociologist, I'm a human geographer, so it made sense for me to look at these things, but it came to me quite late in the day. So I started off looking at Muslims, and I looked at Muslims as a sociologist of religion, so I had no interest in any kind of theological aspect, but I was interested in people who form together around a faith, around a shared identity, around a shared kind of sense of importance outside of themselves that they could attach to. And I did my PhD at Bristol on a statistical mapping of Muslims in Britain, and it was part funded by the Muslim Council of Britain. And I began my PhD literally days after 9/11 happened. So, I was just plodding along thinking, oh, I'm really interested in the sociology of religion, and then 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden I'm working with the Muslim Council of Britain. And I finished my PhD and published my book just as 7/7 happened. So I got very much, I suppose, thrown into an area of investigation that I hadn't expected to, but I was also having to answer quite difficult questions, partly on behalf of the community, because I'm now working with MCB, but also on behalf of myself in terms of my own identity and whether this really kind of tallied up with my own personal experience and the experience of those around me. And one thing that I became increasingly uncomfortable with was that Muslims were being seen as, this monolithic group, and that there were a number of studies that were kind of coming to the forefront that I was using and quoting and using to argue my own position as well, in terms of my academic position. But yes, for Muslims, Islam or religion is the most important identity. But I knew that wasn't the case in many respects, and I think one of the most important examples at the time was probably Kurdish activism that was continuing in Europe, they certainly didn't mobilise around their religious identity, but if anything were very much sort of pushing that to the side and wanting to highlight their Kurdish identity, which was being masked by the nations, if you like. And then alongside that, there was the Kashmiri Broadcasting Corporation, KBC, that was being shown in the homes of my mother and many people like my mother. So I was very aware that actually this local regional identity is really important, and it's also really important in how they view themselves in terms of being a Muslim and what kind of Islam they prescribe to. So I knew that at a sort of a micro level, if you like. But looking at the macro level, Islam was really important and Muslims were feeling marginalised, and there was an increase in Islamophobia, and no doubt that sort of trickled down to grassroots communities and was kind of going not only top down but bottom up. But I wanted to start to kind of detangle some of these difficult issues around identity, and particularly what I was interested in is how young people from the what I call Baha'i community, what you call Kashmiri community, and just so we're not in any confusion about the population that I'm talking about here, I'm talking about people who arrived from the southern part of what is now known as Azad, Jammu Kashmir. So I'm not talking about the valley when I talk about Kashmir, it's just for this presentation purpose. So I'm essentially talking about the Mirpur district and surrounding areas. Now, increasingly, many young people who have their heritage in that particular geography seem to be rejecting the interpretations of Islam that their parents brought with them. And it felt like there was almost kind of a pan-Arab shift, so we've all seen it, we've all experienced it. So now the young men from this community are wearing their trousers above their ankles, and they're growing their beards, and they have to be this long, etc., etc. So it was almost as though the symbols that we had from our parents that that demonstrated what it was to be a Muslim were being replaced. And I thought this was interesting because it's happening in a British context. And there were a few things that were happening when I was trying to investigate this. And what I found is that in relation to this diaspora community in particular, there's anecdotal evidence that there's marginalisation, and some of the studies that have been commissioned here were sort of trying to tease these things out. Of course, it's hard to identify whether people from Kashmir are more marginalised than those from mainland or Pakistan proper because of the way that the ethnic monitoring happens. We can't disaggregate them very easily. But two things that were absolutely definite, without any doubt, is that there is widespread stigmatisation of this diaspora community, and also stereotyping and othering. So this happens particularly within those who are also from other subcontinent groups, but particularly those from Pakistan and Punjab. So I wondered how that might affect people, young people from the AJK diaspora in terms of their identity and whether they felt that they belonged and who they belonged to and where they belonged. And one of the things that was really obvious to me was the stigmatisation around language, particularly the fact that people were telling them to be, so a very common theme that would come up in social media, for example, was that people from AJK didn't know how to speak properly. They couldn't speak Punjabi properly. Or they were calling themselves Kashmiri, but they weren't really Kashmiri because they're not from the valley. So there were all these things that were kind of coming up in terms of disputing their identity. And actually then subsequent studies that had happened had found that people from AJK couldn't actually say who they were or what language they spoke. Now to me, as a young person who is battling with issues to do with heritage, if you can't even say who you are, and you can't even say what your language is, or defend your right to speak that language to people who are telling you that you can't speak your language, there's something really wrong. So, I am not a linguist by any means, but I really tackled this from a kind of a socio-linguistic perspective. So it's really about how people perceive who they are and what they speak, and there was some historical context in this, and I had some help from our friend here who had been studying the language for a lot longer than I had. So I decided that it was particularly important given that evidence shows that Bahari speakers form one of the largest non-European ethnic groups in the UK. Now that's remarkable if you think that this language is spoken, or the speakers of this language form one of the largest populations in this country, yet it's not even classified or defined or recognised as an official language, I think is remarkable. Not only with language but also with ethnicity, there's still a lot of confusion about who these people are, how they should be categorised, both officially and unofficially. And this really has an impact for mainstream sort of service provisions when trying to accommodate these communities. So when I was trying to unpick this, I was looking at why it is that the language is seen primarily as Punjabi. And in the paper that I originally wrote, I was trying to be smart, and I had a subsection which said, it's all Punjabi to me. Which is, it's all, what is it, Russian, Greek, what is that? Yes. And I was trying to be clever. And the reviewer sent it back and said, we know what you're trying to say, but, that's not particularly academic, so I rewrote the subheading. But essentially that is what happened. At some point, linguists who were British linguists who were working in the subcontinent had decided that because of the kind of the shifting geographical marker for the region, that actually Pahari was probably Punjabi, or we could connect it to one of the neighbouring languages and therefore just stick them in the same group. So it literally felt as sort of haphazard as that. There was no thinking behind, or no consultation with the people who spoke this language on behalf of the British colonisers when they were trying to categorise these languages. And unfortunately, this led to it being assumed to be a kind of a sub-form of Punjabi rather than a language in its own right. And this is what we were dealing with. So I was kind of then set to the task at trying to provide evidence that actually it was a language, or it is a language in its own right. And without going into too much detail about how I did that, because the paper is available online, I felt satisfied that I was able to do that, as did the reviewers, and this is why the paper is published. But I think the important thing to note here around sort of identity and belonging is that by being perceived as a lower non-standard variant of Punjabi was the primary reason that this language became stigmatised in this country amongst other diasporas. So the second half of the paper really looked at what that meant for people who spoke this language. And there has definitely been exclusion from mainstream minority media services. So, for example, the BBC Asian Network, I think they have a short Mewbray, they call it Mewbray language program, which I've listened to, and I don't know who the person's speaking, but it's not a Pahari that I necessarily identify with. It seems like a bit of a botched job. But even in that, where it does feature in minority mainstream media, it features as Mewbray or as something else. And by doing so, it's taken the ownership again from us, or from the language itself. By calling it Mewbray rather than Pahari, it's saying that it is just a dialect of a particular small city or a district, rather than sort of understanding that it is a language and that if anything, it's a dialect of an established language branch known as Pahari. So there had been a real movement in this country to try and address this, and it was really about reclaiming the language, and in doing so, providing a voice for the language on a more official basis. And one of the ways that happened was to develop an alphabet for Pahari. And it's not that Pahari didn't have an alphabet before, because we know that Buddhists use Shabda Pahari for Buddhist script. But there was an attempt to make Pahari accessible for people in this country. And one thing that the authors knew, and I will let them talk about this during the questions, one thing that the authors knew is that although a significant proportion of people who had migrated from Azad Kashmir couldn't read or write, what they did know is that they could read the Quran. So they developed the alphabet, a Pahari alphabet, using Quranic script, which was really amazing thing to do. But it just meant that it opened up the language in terms of it having now a written script for people to read. Of course, there were attempts to broadcast the language, not by sort of mainstream media outlets such as the Asian Network, but by the diaspora themselves. So again, they were claiming their right to use the language in the way that they wanted to. But also, the other thing that has happened is that young people haven't given the language up. So there's increasing space on the internet that is being used by young people who will name this language any number of things, and this is because the language hasn't been classified. So, we have Meerpuri Boys, we have, Miki Karo Pakistan, and all those other kind of youth-led programs that have been uploaded to the internet. And what this demonstrates is that the language is still living and young people are still using it. They just don't know what to call it. But it is very much part of their identity because they're using it and they maintain that exchange with their parents and their grandparents, and not only those but also their peers. Meerpuri Boys, I'm certain, wasn't made for parents because of the language that is used in it. I'm sure, it's made for people of the same generation. So what that is saying is that young people want to keep using this language to communicate amongst themselves, even though they can easily do that in English if they choose, but they have decided that actually they would also like to use their mother tongue. So, by understanding that Bahari still very much exists, it's still very much alive, that the population that speak it are probably one of the largest non-European minority populations in this country. It's particularly important that we keep lobbying for it to be recognised officially, because we know that language and identity, once it is officially recognised, does allow a certain sense of recognition, which obviously leads to higher self-esteem of the people who are using that language, because it's seen as a valid language in its own right. It's also really important for heritage maintenance. So, in two ways. I mean, not only in the way that I described with Meerpuri Boys, but it's also really important for heritage maintenance in the sense that once it becomes an official language, mainstream minority media outlets like Asian Network will understand that they have a responsibility to their viewers and their listeners, because this is now an official Asian language, so they have to cater for it. So it's really important in those respects. But it also helps others to understand the community in their own right, and to understand that this is a community that have some distinct characteristics. And I won't go into how distinct we are compared to our neighbours or not. But it is very evident that we are seen as distinct by the other. Otherwise they wouldn't be talking about us. And they wouldn't be saying, unfortunately, many of the things that are being said are very negative, but clearly they see us as distinct, otherwise they wouldn't be making these distinctions. So it allows us to own our distinction as well, rather than have that imposed on us. And it allows us to say what we think that distinction is. And of course, from a policy perspective, in terms of service provision and needs, it's really important to be able to cater for those appropriately. So that is a very short version of why I thought it was important to explore it. I obviously haven't gone into any detail about the language itself, mainly because, as I said, there is a paper online and I didn't want to do it any disservice, but it's available to download.